Today is a day which is combining Building Bridges and UNEP FI, and the first 50 minutes is going to be about accelerating systems change through finance, continuing the spirit of yesterday. We're going to be hearing from Patrick and Eric. We'll be hearing from Rémi Rioux, who's going to be joining us virtually from Paris. We're going to be hearing from the IFC, and then we're going to be reflecting on the rights, the human rights, which underpin so much of the judgment that we're making here, and we'll be hearing from two leading figures in that area as well before 10 to 10. So let me invite Eric and Patrick up onto the platform. They're going to talk to each other without me, which is a great relief, probably. So Eric, I shall welcome, the head of UNEP FI, and also Patrick Odier, who many of you would have seen yesterday, who's chair of Building Bridges. Bonjour.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nick, and a pleasure to be with you all this morning and to bring together the Building Bridges and the UNEP FI community. First time we've done this, and so far, so very good. I think we're going to start by trying to frame, and there were some very good discussions yesterday at Building Bridges, but we're going to start to frame the discussions for the next couple of days with a couple key points to try to position where are we at today. And I think, let me take the first one, maybe to state the obvious, climate action is falling short and the political headwinds are growing. But I think for you all in the room, generally acknowledge that the direction of travel is clear, both in terms of the science, including, for instance, the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, but in terms of the technological industrial revolutions that are getting underway. I think on the negative side, UNEP's emissions gap report has, puts it in stark relief. 2023 emissions grew 1.3% to 57 gigatons. We need to drive down emissions 7.5% per year between now and 2030 if we're going to hope to stick to a 1.5 trajectory. So we need to bring them down 42%. If policy commitments as stated today are fully carried out, then we are looking the potential to reduce emissions by 10% by 2030. That means roughly 2.6%. Of warming. So much more policy ambition is needed. On the positive side, there is green shoots. So there are some really significant positive developments. You can draw on many, I think. Global EV, new car vehicle registrations globally, 17% last year. In China, over 50%. Different sectors, different industries are turning over. No one can turn a blind eye to, the only constant today is change. A couple more statistics. Indonesia recently announced plans to retire all coal and to build 75 gigawatts of new renewables capacity in the next 15 years. India has delivered 80% of its 2030 land restoration target, restoring almost 19 million hectares. Now, I mentioned these three. They come from the Asia region. For many reasons, we know Asia is key to our future, and we are seeing some positive developments. What about the financial trends? If I can quote our good friend Christiana Figueres, where finance goes, so goes emissions. And I'm very pleased to report that since signing up to the Net Zero Banking Alliance in 2021, 80% of the world's largest banks have decreased their financing for fossil fuels, some by as much as 50%. And I say that quoting data from many of the big NGOs who are normally so critical on the banks. But if you read into the numbers, there are some positive signs. Signatories to the UN Principles for Responsible Banking have surpassed 50% of global banking assets, including now all the globally systemically important is the G-SIB banks from China, from whom we're really pleased to have a very strong delegation this week, as well as from many other parts of the world. We have a contingent of insurers as well, representing the principles for sustainable insurance. And these insurers, many of them are also part along with pension funds of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And they have published data earlier this year that show that they as a group, which represent 89 investors, $10 trillion US in assets, that they have been driving down their emissions roughly 6% per year over the last 5 years. So a little bit falling short of the 7.5, but still remarkable progress in showing that it is possible. And this year we have the very significant, the Building Bridges financial community, with who we're very pleased to have partnered for this joint convening and to build up the energy. These are all important pieces and constituencies in the climate action puzzle, but I think you all agree that the full picture will require the formal climate process to pick up the pace. And for that, let me hand it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Eric. As we hear you, I think we realize that many things are happening despite, of course, the negative mood that has been brought by all those turbulences of the 2024 year. And I think that if you look at, for instance, the recent COPs, whether in Baku or in Cali, actually, yes, we noticed that the pace is probably not as fast as it should, but the scale at which now we're approaching the problems has improved in a significant way. The fact that the new financial goal for the developed countries to provide 300 billion to developing countries is frustrating. It can be understood, of course, because the figures that were put to the negotiation were much higher, but we just had completed the first commitment of the 100 billion 2 years ago, and I think to triple this initial commitment is already a sign that we want to, and the world is really moving in the right direction. I think we should recognize that. What is important, I think, is to make sure that we progress also in defining how this financing will be provided, and what will be the public and the private part of it. And I think, as we said yesterday, galvanizing the private sector is of the essence today. We know that we need private money and private capital, and I think in this respect, that's probably where the COP, the recent COP in Baku felt really short, in my view. More promising on the other side was, of course, the discussions on the carbon market and on the rules for governing country-to-country carbon trading under Article 6.2. I think this is really interesting because this really will make the difference and help us progress towards pricing externalities I think, in a very determined way. These new rules will establish actually the first world Paris-aligned crediting standards, that is about 10 years after these standards were, the Paris Agreement was signed. And I think this will include environmental and human rights safeguards as well as additionality checks and things like this. And this is what the market is really waiting for. In terms of mitigation, what government did take forward was any progress. It was, of course, that there was no progress in operationalizing the transition away from fossil fuel. I personally did not understand why there was so much publicity made about it. I think we had last year, at the very last minute, a very, very forceful statement made at the COP, and it is a bit of a pity that this discussion turned out this way at the time where we all agreed to phase out fossil fuel. To put this back into the question was probably not that positive. At the Nature COP, well, we had a major breakthrough also by having over 100 countries, 119 countries submitting national biodiversity targets, and progress was made in many areas that touches on biodiversity, whether it's sustainable wildlife management, invading alien species, etc. And I think this has to be recognized also as a progress. So, of course, short of ambitions, but progressing nevertheless on the right track. Action on nature, as we heard also yesterday, is absolutely essential, not only for nature, but also for climate. Actually, one can ask whether it really will make sense in the future to continue to have two COPs, one on nature and one on climate. We should probably bring the two together as fast as we can. But we should now certainly move from how to what, and what should be the systemic transition needed to take place now in order to make sure that our global system, our global economic system aligns with the global biodiversity framework itself. So a sort of a view today that many things have been negatively put to us, but while at the same time things are progressing, we have now areas of focus where we can all concentrate on.
Great. So I think the reality today is for you all to learn to operate in a multipolar world and to read between the lines, to understand where the movements are happening. Central banks organized under the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, have released findings last month that show that climate change is becoming a first-order factor for economies. They specifically found that a lack of policy ambition increases costs of mitigation policies and further increases economic losses from the physical impacts of climate change. But even with the economics becoming increasingly clear, jurisdictions are developing regulatory approaches to sustainable finance at varying speeds. Europe has been at the forefront, while Asia Pacific and Latin America have seen quite noteworthy progress in recent years. Africa is still in the early stages, and North America, to be frank, is moving in some different directions. Operating in a multipolar world is challenging, and more interoperability is needed between approaches, for instance, between taxonomies and frameworks for transition finance. But we believe for the financial sector really to play its enabling role, really effectively, we need clear and actionable national transition plans from governments. We start to see this from some, but we need it from more. These plans should outline the decarbonization trajectory, the deployment of climate solutions, and the regulatory frameworks incentives that will support their implementation. And of course, governments and MDBs and other development finance institutions need to scale up blended finance as a key tool for linking national decarbonization targets with sector-specific transitions by mobilizing capital for some of the high-impact projects that otherwise lack funding. Patrick, with all the conflicting signals, which way should financiers be focusing?
Well, I think, finance and business should really focus on navigating towards the future and not towards the latest election cycle, actually. While political fluctuation may temporarily, of course, slow down the overall efforts towards climate and sustainability action in some jurisdiction, wherever we think now, or it's in different jurisdictions, is a discussion to have. The overall trajectory, as we heard, is there. We know that we are in the midst of the transition. We heard it yesterday from Johan Rockström, for instance, and that was not a usual comment from him, and I think this is very good news. So what we know is that finance and business in general is now engaged, and that we have to look at reinvesting in the tooling of the economies for energy, for security, for growth, and for green jobs, and this is creating huge opportunities, and I think that's the good news about the situation. Financiers and corporates who only focus on the near term will, of course, exist and continue to exist, but I think what they risk here is major stranding of assets, and I think the risk will become very obvious to most of the financial circles and economic circles. There will be 5, 6 elections in every democracy between now and 2050, so we cannot afford as businesses to just react to those elections anymore. Some will help, some will hinder, some will be signals, some will be really obstacles, but the long term, as we heard, is becoming shorter, and we have to make sure that we use this opportunity now to really reinvest massively in the right directions for a more sustainable economy. And that's, I think, recognized by the financial sector. It's going to be cheaper and more competitive to be sustainable as not to be sustainable. So better look through policy and landscape towards the scientific and technology trends that provide better compass for the way forward. This is what really is needed today, and I think this is where the financial sector is really focusing. So we have to admit that anti-ESG and anti-greenwash pressure have somehow had an impact. I think they have had also the impact of eliminating perhaps the superficial types of considerations that we have had in this debate. And it has also made clear that those active in sustainable finance need to be now more than ever able to make the case of why sustainable and sustainable investment and sustainable finance is the right business rationale for their approach.
Great. So I think, in closing, it's clear you all face a very complex landscape in 2025 and going forward for the coming years. Some would say actually going up to 2050, there will be 4 or 5 or 6 different governments in each democratic jurisdiction. You need to operate in those that are helping and those that are hindering. Your business needs to be based on longer term projection and steering. Challenges, especially around regulatory fragmentation, compliance costs, some ESG pushback. I think seeing through these, the opportunities, the potential for financial institutions in terms of doing good business are considerable. So with that, we'd really like to thank you to get started today, to bring together the discussions of building bridges and UNEP's Global Roundtable. This is why you're here, to sort through, to understand these trends and to figure out how together we can work on market-centric solutions to drive forward, to drive us towards a sustainable future. Thank you very much and looking forward to today's discussions.
Thank you.